Today I'm going to be talking about the era of Reconstruction. First, I have to talk about the state of the South after the Civil War. The South was in ruins after the Civil War. There was a great amount of wartime destruction, and there was no labor force due to no slavery. And the North had to decide on what terms the South should be readmitted into the Union, and what were the rights of former slaves, and how should they be protected. First, I'm going to be talking about Johnson's plan for Reconstruction versus the Radical Republicans' plan for Reconstruction. Remember that Andrew Johnson was the president after Lincoln died. So Johnson adopted Lincoln's plan with one extra term. The Southern states must take allegiance to the U.S. The states would have to guarantee the abolition of slavery, and states must not allow some Confederate leaders to vote while allowing all Southern white males to vote. The Radical Republicans had a different plan, which was way harsher to the South. They wanted to treat the South like conquered territories and wanted rights for freed slaves. This included black suffrage, no Confederate leaders could hold office, and the South would be occupied by federal troops. There were some post-Civil War amendments that were passed as the Radical Republicans controlled Congress during Johnson's presidency. They passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. The 13th Amendment, which was passed in 1865, declared slavery illegal in every state. Then we have the 14th Amendment, which was passed in 1868, where stated that all persons born in U.S. are citizens of the nation and state, and that states can't interfere with the rights of citizens. Then we have the 15th Amendment, which was passed in 1870, which established black suffrage. Then we have black codes and the Radical Republicans' response. The South held conventions a year after the Civil War to organize a new government. They ended up making black codes, which were codes that tried to heavily restrict the rights of freed slaves. The Radical Republicans were mad at the black code, so they pushed a bunch of Reconstruction laws. The Freedmen's Bureau was created in 1865, which provided aid and education for nearly 4 million slaves. The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1866, which combated black codes by giving federal government the power to protect the rights of blacks. And Congress divided South into 5 districts, and each district was occupied by federal troops. Now onto the impeachment of Johnson. Johnson was always pissing off fellow Republicans by constantly vetoing their laws. And this all came to a boil when, in 1867, Congress passes the Tenure of Office Act, which says that a president cannot fire a cabinet member without Senate approval. However, Johnson ignores this and fires Stanton. The House Republicans call for impeachment before one vote short of impeaching Johnson. There were 2 views on Reconstruction. We have the North point of view and the South point of view. The North point of view was that many Northerners moved to the South for economic and political gain. Republicans, with the Freedmen support, win 4 out of 7 Southern elections, 10 out of 14 Senate seats, and 20 out of 35 House seats, and some blacks were even elected. And in the South point of view, the main goal of Southern whites during Reconstruction was to revive the economy, regain control of state governments, and reduce the political power of Southern blacks. The South named the Northerners who moved to the South carpetbaggers because they were taking advantage and profiteering off the Southern economic distress. And in every Southern state, white power societies formed, such as the KKK in 1866. Now to Southern agriculture. After the Civil War, sharecropping and tenant farming took the place of slavery and the plantation system in the South. Sharecropping was where the poor Southerners, whites and blacks, would pay a certain percent of their crops to the landlord in exchange for land. And it was very hard to pay the debt. It was basically economic bondage. And we have tenant farming, where some plantation owners rented out their land to tenants who worked on the land. Now, what were the status of the freedmen? Well, we should talk about black hopes versus reality. In the beginning of Reconstruction, black Southerners had hopes that the government would protect their civil rights as voters due to the 15th Amendment, and they also had some hopes of the government giving them land grants. In reality, the government provided no land, and Southern whites were determined to stop black suffrage. Some blacks did get elected in Southern legislature during the start of Reconstruction, which was a silver lining. Now onto the Civil Rights Act and segregation. In both the North and the South, blacks were regarded as inferior. Another Civil Rights Act was passed in 1875 which prohibited owners of railroads, restaurants, and other public places from discriminating against blacks. This was obeyed for a few years but eventually stopped. In 1881, Southern states started to adopt Jim Crow laws, and by 1890s, segregation was everywhere in the South. Now on to the end of the Reconstruction era. By 1877, all Southern states were controlled by Democrats and all federal troops were removed from the South. As time went on, white Northerners got tired of Reconstruction issues and became less concerned with protecting the rights of blacks. By 1875, they wanted to remove troops from the South. The radical Republicans started to lose their grip on Congress, which allowed for the Amnesty Act to pass in 1872. That allowed for 160,000 former Confederates to vote. White power societies also grew in power, and federal government could not and probably would not stop them. That meant that blacks stopped going to polls and voting. Now on to the election of 1876 and the Compromise of 1877, which was the nail in the coffin for Reconstruction. During the election, which was Tilden versus Hayes, there was a conflict with Southern states, and a special commission was called to declare the winner. The commission had more Republicans, so Hayes won. The Democrats were extremely mad, and some even wanted to take arms and fight. So that led to the Compromise of 1877, where Hayes would become president, but the last of the federal troops had to leave the South. Now the blacks were abandoned and were ruled by the Southern whites. Basically, the Northern commitment to Reconstruction was over. And now on to Supreme Court cases. Blacks went to court to challenge Jim Crow laws due to the 14th Amendment. We have some civil rights cases in 1883 where the Supreme Court ruled that Jim Crow laws were constitutional and that the 14th Amendment only applied to government officials and not private citizens. And finally, we have Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, where the Supreme Court ruled that a segregated railroad car was not unconstitutional. They were quoted as saying it was separate but equal. Justice John Harlan dissented and said that segregation threatened personal liberty and equal rights.